Have you ever looked at an old photograph and felt like something was watching you back? Today, we're diving into one of the most disturbing photographic mysteries ever documented, a seemingly innocent family portrait from 1901 that conceals a secret so chilling. It remained hidden for over 100 years. What started as a routine restoration project turned into an investigation that would haunt everyone involved. If you enjoy this type of content, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel grow. The photograph first surfaced in 2019 at a small estate sale in Salem, Massachusetts. Martha Whitmore, a professional photograph conservator specializing in Victorian-era images, purchased a box of damaged daguerreotypes and glass plate negatives for $200. Among the collection was an unremarkable cabinet card, a popular photographic format from the turn of the century, depicting what appeared to be an affluent couple posed in their parlor. The image showed a man and woman dressed in their finest attire. The husband wore a dark three-piece suit with a high collar and watch chain, his mustache meticulously groomed in the fashion of the era. His wife sat beside him in an elaborate dress with leg-of-mutton sleeves, her hair swept up in the Gibson girl style that dominated women's fashion at the time. Behind them, the Victorian parlor displayed all the markers of upper-middle-class prosperity: ornate wallpaper, heavy drapes, a marble-topped side table, and various decorative objects that spoke to their social status. Martha initially set the photograph aside, prioritizing more visibly damaged pieces. But something about the image kept drawing her attention. Perhaps it was the couple's expressions. Neither smiled, as was customary for photographs requiring long exposure times, but their faces held an unusual tension. The woman's hands, folded in her lap, appeared clenched rather than relaxed. The man's jaw seemed set, almost defiant. 3 weeks after the purchase, Martha finally began the restoration process. She carefully cleaned the cabinet card's surface, removing over a century of accumulated dust and grime. She then scanned the image at high resolution, 12,000 dpi, to examine every detail and plan her restoration strategy. This level of magnification revealed textures invisible to the naked eye, the weave of fabric, individual strands of hair, minute imperfections in the photographic emulsion. It was during this detailed examination that Martha noticed something peculiar in the background. The Victorian parlor, as was typical of the era, featured multiple decorative elements and furnishings. But tucked into the shadows behind the couple, barely visible in the original print, was what appeared to be a third figure, a child. Martha adjusted the contrast and brightness of her digital scan. The child came into sharper focus. A girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, stood partially obscured by the heavy drapes. She wore a white dress, and her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders. Unlike the posed couple in the foreground, the child wasn't looking at the camera. Her head was turned at an odd angle, as if she'd been caught mid-movement during the long exposure. This discovery, while interesting, wasn't particularly unusual. Victorian family photographs often included children positioned in the background, and the long exposure times required for photography in that era frequently resulted in blurred or ghostly figures when subjects moved. Martha made a note of the child's presence and continued her examination. But as she zoomed in further, focusing on different sections of the photograph, something about the child began to unsettle her. The girl's face, though partially shadowed, showed an expression that seemed wrong. Her mouth was open slightly, not in a smile or neutral expression, but in what looked like a silent scream or gasp. More disturbing was her eyes. Even in the shadows, even with the technical limitations of 1901 photography, the child's eyes were startlingly clear and focused. Not on the camera, but on something beyond the frame. Something that had captured her complete and undivided attention. The intensity of that gaze, frozen for over a century, sent an involuntary chill through Martha's studio. She pulled back from the screen, rubbing her eyes. She'd been working for 6 hours straight, examining dozens of damaged photographs. Fatigue could play tricks on perception, but when she looked again, that disturbing quality remained. The child's expression wasn't captured by accident or technical limitation. It appeared deliberate, preserved with crystal clarity, while other elements of the photograph showed the typical softness of the era. Martha saved her work and decided to research the photograph's provenance. The cabinet card bore the stamp of Ashworth & Son Photography, Salem, Mass. On its reverse side, along with a handwritten notation, Aldrich Family, October 1901. Indeed, a quick search revealed that the Ashworth Photography Studio had operated in Salem from 1887 to 1923, known for serving the city's more affluent residents. Finding information about the Aldrich family proved more challenging. Salem's historical records from the early 1900s were extensive but fragmented. After several hours of searching through digitized census records, city directories, and newspaper archives, Martha located an entry for Edmund and Catherine Aldrich, who had resided at 47 Charter Street in 1900. Edmund worked as a shipping merchant, and the census listed 3 children in the household: Margaret, age 12, William, age 9, and Sarah, age 7. But when Martha checked the 1910 census, only Edmund and Catherine remained at the Charter Street address. No children were listed. She expanded her search, looking for death records, marriage certificates, anything that might explain where the Aldrich children had gone. The search yielded nothing for Margaret or William. But for Sarah Aldrich, she found a brief death notice in the Salem Evening News, dated November 3, 1901, just weeks after the family photograph was taken. The notice was remarkably sparse. Sarah Aldrich, daughter of Edmund and Catherine Aldrich of Charter Street, aged 7 years. Services private. Interment at Harmony Grove Cemetery. No cause of death was mentioned, no description of illness or accident, just a cold, factual acknowledgement of a child's passing. Martha returned to the photograph with renewed focus. Could the child in the background be Sarah? The timing aligned. The photograph was dated October 1901, and Sarah had died in early November. But something didn't add up. If this was a formal family portrait, why would Sarah be positioned in the shadows, partially hidden, while her siblings were absent from the frame entirely? She began examining every inch of the photograph with forensic attention to detail. The couple's positioning, the arrangement of furniture, the play of light and shadow, everything was deliberate, carefully composed according to the photographic conventions of the era. Everything except the child in the background. As Martha studied the image late into the evening, another detail emerged that she'd initially overlooked. The child's reflection appeared in the parlor's mirror, mounted on the wall behind the couple, but the reflection didn't match the child's position. The angle was wrong, impossible given where she stood. It was as if the mirror was showing something or someone from a different moment, a different reality. If you're enjoying the video so far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps. Martha's hands trembled slightly as she made this observation. She'd restored thousands of Victorian photographs, seen countless technical anomalies created by primitive equipment and chemical processes. But this was different. This wasn't a double exposure or chemical stain. This was something the camera had captured that defied logical explanation. She decided to reach out to colleagues, sharing the image with other conservators and photography historians. The response was immediate and divided. Some dismissed the oddities as artifacts of early photographic processes. Others found the image deeply unsettling, agreeing that something about the child's presence felt wrong, felt staged or manipulated in a way that transcended the technical capabilities of 1901. As word spread through the professional community, the photograph began attracting attention from a wider audience. Forensic photographers, historians, and paranormal researchers all requested access to the high-resolution scans. Each brought their expertise, each sought to explain what the camera had captured on that October day in 1901. But the more people examined the photograph, the more questions emerged. And at the center of every question was the child in the shadows, Sarah Aldrich, who would be dead within weeks of this photograph being taken. And the terrible secret, her frozen gaze seemed desperate to reveal. Dr. James Reeves, a professor of photographic history at Boston University, became the first academic to seriously investigate the Aldrich photograph. His initial interest was purely technical. He specialized in identifying fraudulent Victorian spirit photography, the popular 19th century practice of creating fake images of ghosts through double exposure and other tricks. He assumed the Aldrich photograph would prove to be another example of period manipulation. Dr. Reeves obtained the original cabinet card from Martha Whitmore and subjected it to comprehensive analysis. He examined the paper stock, the albumin print process, the mounting technique, and the chemical composition of the photographic emulsion. Every test confirmed the photograph's authenticity as a genuine 1901 image with no evidence of manipulation, double exposure, or modern digital alteration. The cabinet card's physical characteristics matched other confirmed Ashworth studio work from the same period. The paper bore the correct watermark for early 1900s photographic stock. The albumin layer showed appropriate aging patterns, a network of fine cracks called crazing that develops naturally over decades. The mounting adhesive corresponded to formulations used in that era. Most tellingly, microscopic examination revealed no signs of retouching, masking, or composite printing that would indicate deliberate manipulation. Dr. Reeves then turned his attention to the photographic content itself. He created three-dimensional depth maps of the image, analyzing how light fell across different elements to determine their spatial relationships. The results were puzzling. The child appeared to occupy a physical space within the room, consistent with the perspective and lighting. She wasn't a reflection, wasn't a double exposure overlaid on the background. She was there, in that parlor, when the photograph was taken. But the mirror reflection presented an impossible paradox. Dr. Reeves spent days analyzing the geometric relationships between the child's position, the mirror's placement, and the reflection visible in that mirror. No matter how he calculated the angles, the reflection shouldn't exist. For the child to appear in the mirror at that angle, she would need to be standing several feet to the left of her actual position. Or the mirror itself would need to be angled differently than the photograph clearly showed. Frustrated by the physical impossibility, Dr. Reeves decided to investigate the historical context more thoroughly. He traveled to Salem and spent a week examining city records, newspaper archives, and the remaining files of the Ashworth Photography Studio, which had been donated to the Salem Historical Society after the business closed in 1923. The studio records proved illuminating. An appointment ledger from October 1901 showed that Edmund Aldrich had scheduled a sitting for October 12th, a Saturday afternoon. The notation read, "Aldrich family portrait, formal parlor setting, 3 hours p.m. But a handwritten addendum in different ink stated, "Rescheduled to residence, client request, October 19th. This was unusual. While wealthy clients sometimes requested home sittings, most preferred the controlled environment of a photography studio, where lighting and backdrops could be carefully managed. Dr. Reeves searched for correspondence that might explain the change, but found none. However, he did locate the studio's billing records, which showed that Edmund Aldrich had paid for the sitting in advance, a substantial sum of $12, and had never requested a refund despite receiving only a single print instead of the typical dozen copies ordered by families for distribution to relatives. The Salem Evening News archives revealed more troubling details about the Aldrich family. In late September 1901, approximately 3 weeks before the photograph was taken, the newspaper ran a brief item about a disturbance at the Aldrich residence. Police were summoned to Charter Street on the evening of September 24th, following reports of screaming. Officers found no evidence of wrongdoing, and the matter was resolved privately. 2 weeks later, another mention. The Aldrich residence on Charter Street has become the subject of neighborhood concern following repeated nocturnal disturbances. Mr. Edmund Aldrich has assured authorities that the matter involves only domestic difficulties and requires no intervention. Then, in mid-October, just days before the family photograph was taken, a more detailed article appeared. Neighbors concerned for Charter Street child. The piece described growing worry among the Aldrich family's neighbors about young Sarah Aldrich, who had reportedly been seen at odd hours, walking through the house at night, appearing at windows, and behaving in ways described as peculiar and deeply troubling. The article quoted an anonymous neighbor. "The child seems wrong somehow. She stands at windows in the middle of the night, just staring out at nothing. And her eyes, there's something not right about her eyes. It's as if she's looking at things the rest of us cannot see." Dr. Reeves felt a chill reading these words while examining the photograph. The child's eyes in the image, that fixed, intense stare focused on something beyond the frame, suddenly took on new significance. What had Sarah been looking at? What had captured her attention so completely that it registered even through the primitive photography of 1901? The death notice from November 3rd provided no additional information, but Dr. Reeves discovered something that earlier searches had missed. A week after Sarah's death, the Salem Evening News ran a longer obituary, likely paid for by the family. In memoriam, Sarah Catherine Aldrich, beloved daughter of Edmund and Catherine, departed this life November 1st, in the 8th year of her age. A child of uncommon sensitivity and perception, she is now at peace. Private services were held. The family requests no visitors and asks to be left to their grief. November 1st, not November 3rd, as the earlier notice had stated. Dr. Reeves noted the discrepancy, but more intriguing was the phrasing: uncommon sensitivity and perception, and she is now at peace. These weren't typical Victorian euphemisms for a child's death. They suggested something specific about Sarah's condition before she died. Dr. Reeves expanded his search to medical records. In 1901, most medical care was provided by private physicians who maintained their own records, many of which had been lost to time. However, he managed to locate the archived papers of Dr. Nathaniel Whitcomb, who had practiced in Salem during that period and whose patient lists included several Charter Street families. Among Dr. Whitcomb's case notes, he found repeated entries for Sarah Aldrich spanning late September through late October 1901. The notes were clinical but disturbing. Child presence with severe sleep disturbances, speaks of visions and presences. Parents report increasingly erratic behavior. Physical examination reveals no organic cause. Recommended mild sedation and isolation from stimulation. A later entry from October 15th, Sarah's condition deteriorating. Child now appears in trance-like states, unresponsive to surroundings, claims to see the woman in the walls and the man who watches. The parents are distraught. Increased sedation recommended. The final entry, dated October 28th, was brief and chilling. Called to Aldrich residence emergency. Found child in parlor, unresponsive but conscious, eyes fixed on corner of room. Parents report she has been in this state for 3 hours. Unable to rouse her despite repeated attempts, prognosis uncertain. 4 days later, Sarah was dead. The cause of death listed in Dr. Whitcomb's notes: acute nervous exhaustion and failure to thrive. But a handwritten notation in the margin suggested the physician's true bewilderment. In 30 years of practice, I have never witnessed such a case. The child seemed to be watching something until the very end. Dr. Reeves returned to the photograph with this new context. Sarah's position in the shadows, her fixed stare, her parents' tense expressions, everything suddenly formed a coherent but deeply unsettling picture. This wasn't a typical family portrait. This was documentation of something Edmund and Catherine Aldrich had wanted recorded, evidence of whatever was happening in their home. But evidence of what? What had Sarah been seeing that consumed her so completely it eventually killed her? What was captured in that impossible mirror reflection? And why had her parents posed for a formal photograph while their youngest daughter stood in the shadows, transfixed by something the camera could barely capture? Leave a comment below about what you think about this story so far. Dr. Reeves made one more discovery that would deepen the mystery further. Searching through property records for 47 Charter Street, he found that the house had a troubled history even before the Aldriches moved there in 1899. The previous occupants, a family named Morrison, had abandoned the property suddenly in 1898, leaving behind most of their possessions. The house had stood empty for nearly a year before Edmund Aldrich purchased it at a significantly reduced price. A notation in the property transfer documents explained the discount. Seller advises of structural peculiarities and previous tenant complaints regarding atmospherics. In real estate terminology of the era, atmospherics was sometimes a euphemistic way of acknowledging a property's reputation for being haunted. Dr. Reeves located one final piece of information that tied everything together. In December 1901, a month after Sarah's death, Edmund and Catherine Aldrich sold the Charter Street house at a substantial loss and moved to Cambridge. They never returned to Salem, and according to city directories from subsequent years, they never again lived in the same house for more than 2 years, moving repeatedly throughout Massachusetts until Edmund's death in 1921. Their surviving children, Margaret and William, both left Massachusetts as adults, and according to genealogical records Dr. Reeves traced, neither ever had children of their own. The Aldrich family line ended with them, as if the events of 1901 had cast a shadow that prevented any continuation of their bloodline. The photograph remained the only tangible evidence of whatever had happened in that Charter Street parlor. And in that frozen moment from October 1901, Sarah Aldrich continued to stare at something, her eyes reflecting a horror or understanding that the living could not comprehend. Following Dr. Reeves's publication of his findings in the Journal of Photographic History, the Aldrich photograph attracted attention from paranormal researchers and skeptics alike. Among those who took interest was Rachel Chen, a forensic psychologist who specialized in analyzing historical documents and photographs for legal and academic purposes. Unlike the paranormal investigators, Dr. Chen approached the image from a purely psychological and forensic perspective. Dr. Chen's initial analysis focused on the family dynamics visible in the photograph. The body language, positioning, and facial expressions all suggested a family in crisis. Edmund Aldrich's rigid posture and set jaw indicated defensive tension. Catherine's clenched hands and tight expression showed barely controlled distress. And Sarah, relegated to the shadows, literally and figuratively marginalized in the family portrait, appeared to be the center of whatever crisis the family was experiencing. But Dr. Chen wanted to understand more than just the photograph. She wanted to understand the house itself. In March 2020, she traveled to Salem and located 47 Charter Street, now divided into apartments after extensive renovations in the 1970s. The building's exterior had been updated, but the basic Victorian structure remained intact. Dr. Chen interviewed the current residents, asking about any unusual experiences or sensations in the building. She was careful not to mention the photograph or its history, simply presenting herself as a researcher interested in Victorian architecture. The responses were mixed but intriguing. The ground floor apartment resident, a graduate student named Thomas Winters, reported nothing unusual. The second floor tenant, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patricia Holloway, who had lived there since 1982, had a different story. Without prompting, she mentioned that her apartment, which corresponded to what would have been the Aldrich's parlor, had an odd feeling in the corner by the window. "I never liked sitting there," Mrs. Holloway explained. "It always felt like someone was watching from that corner. My cat refuses to go near it, just sits in the doorway and stares, fur standing up. I thought I was being silly, but every guest who's visited has mentioned feeling uncomfortable in that spot without me saying anything." Dr. Chen asked if she could examine the corner. Mrs. Holloway agreed, though she seemed relieved when Dr. Chen suggested doing so during daylight hours. The apartment's layout had been altered over the decades, but by consulting the original architectural plans available at the Salem Historical Society, Dr. Chen was able to determine the corner's precise location in the 1901 parlor. It was the exact spot where Sarah's gaze was fixed in the photograph. The corner itself appeared unremarkable. Painted drywall, modern baseboard heating, a window with contemporary blinds. But Dr. Chen noted that the temperature in that specific area measured approximately 3 degrees cooler than the rest of the room, despite being near the heating unit. She also observed that her phone's compass function showed erratic readings when held in that location, swinging wildly between different magnetic bearings. These observations were suggestive but inconclusive. Temperature variations could have numerous mundane explanations, as could magnetic anomalies in an old building with complex electrical wiring. Dr. Chen was careful not to draw supernatural conclusions from ambiguous data. Instead, she focused on investigating the house's history more thoroughly. Working with the Salem Historical Society, she traced the property's records back to its construction in 1867. The house had been built by a successful textile merchant named Josiah Blackwood, who had lived there with his wife and 4 children until 1895. The Blackwood family's tenure appeared unremarkable until Dr. Chen discovered a personal diary belonging to Abigail Blackwood, Josiah's wife, preserved in the family papers donated to the Historical Society. The diary entries from 1893-1894 told a disturbing story. Abigail wrote repeatedly about her youngest daughter, Emily, who had begun experiencing what the mother described as waking dreams and visions of terrible clarity. Emily, who was 8 years old at the time, reportedly told her mother she could see the ones who came before and the woman who weeps in the walls. The similarity to Dr. Whitcomb's notes about Sarah Aldrich was striking. Both girls were approximately the same age. Both experienced visions. Both mentioned seeing figures that others could not perceive. But Abigail's diary provided more detail about Emily's experiences. Emily speaks of a woman who appears in the corner of the parlor, one entry read. She describes her in such detail, a woman in old-fashioned dress with dark hair and hollow eyes who stands perfectly still and watches. Emily says the woman is sad and angry both, trapped by something that happened long ago. Dr. Morton says these are fever dreams, but Emily is not feverish. She speaks with such certainty, such terror in her eyes. The diary entries became increasingly distressed over the following months. Emily's health deteriorated. She stopped sleeping, stopped eating, became fixated on the corner of the parlor, where she insisted the woman appeared most clearly. The parents consulted multiple physicians, tried various treatments, even brought in a minister to bless the house. Nothing helped. The final entries from early 1895 were heartbreaking. Emily died in April of that year, aged 9. From what Abigail described as a wasting sickness of the spirit. Shortly after, the Blackwood family left the house and moved to Connecticut. Josiah sold the property to a family named Morrison. The Morrison family's stay was brief and apparently troubled, though Dr. Chen found little documentation about their experiences. They lasted less than 3 years before abandoning the house in 1898, leaving behind the notation about atmospherics that had reduced the property's value. Dr. Chen now had documented evidence of at least 2 young girls, roughly the same age, experiencing similar visions in the same house, in the same location, the corner of the parlor. Both had died shortly after their visions began. Both had been around 8 years old. The pattern was undeniable, even if the explanation remained elusive. She decided to investigate the land itself, searching for any historical events that might explain the house's troubled history. Salem's records were extensive, given the city's significance in early American history. What Dr. Chen discovered pushed the mystery back even further in time. Before the house was built in 1867, the land had been part of a larger estate owned by the Prescott family. In 1854, that estate had been the site of a tragedy. Margaret Prescott, aged 28, had died under circumstances described in contemporary accounts as mysterious and lamentable. She had been found in an outbuilding on the property, deceased with no clear cause of death. The newspaper accounts from 1854 were circumspect, as was typical of the era when discussing potentially scandalous deaths. But reading between the lines, Dr. Chen detected suggestions of suicide or possible foul play. Margaret Prescott had been described as melancholic and troubled in spirit in the months before her death. Her family had been estranged from her, and she had been living alone in a small cottage on the estate grounds. The location of that cottage, according to property maps from the 1850s, corresponded almost exactly to where the corner of the Aldrich parlor would later be, the same corner where Emily Blackwood and Sarah Aldrich had focused their terrified attention decades later. Dr. Chen spent days researching Margaret Prescott's life, piecing together a tragic story from fragmentary records. Margaret had been engaged to be married in 1853, but the engagement had been broken under mysterious circumstances. She had been ostracized by Salem society, living in increasing isolation. The few contemporary accounts that mentioned her described a woman consumed by grief and rage, unable to move forward from whatever tragedy had befallen her. If you're enjoying this investigation, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps me continue bringing you these fascinating stories. After her death, the cottage had been torn down and the Prescott estate subdivided and sold. But if the pattern held, if Margaret Prescott's death had somehow left an imprint on that location, then Emily Blackwood and Sarah Aldrich might not have been experiencing delusions or mental illness. They might have been perceiving something real, something that existed outside normal sensory experience, but within the capacity of certain sensitive individuals to detect. Dr. Chen was careful in how she framed this possibility. As a scientist, she couldn't endorse supernatural explanations without evidence. But as someone who had spent years studying human perception and consciousness, she also couldn't dismiss the possibility that reality contained more layers than conventional science acknowledged. She returned to the photograph with this historical context. Sarah Aldrich, standing in the shadows, staring at the corner where Margaret Prescott had died in 1854. The impossible reflection in the mirror, the parents' expressions of barely controlled panic. The photograph now appeared to be more than just documentation. It was a window into a moment when the veil between past and present had become dangerously thin. But one question remained unanswered. Why had Edmund Aldrich commissioned this photograph? If his daughter was experiencing such severe disturbances, if the family was in crisis, why create a formal portrait? What had he hoped to capture or prove? Dr. Chen found a possible answer in an unexpected place. Among the Ashworth Studios' preserved correspondence was a letter from Edmund Aldrich, dated October 14, 1901, 5 days before the photograph was taken. The letter was formal, but desperate. Mr. Ashworth, I require your services for a matter of utmost importance. I need photographic documentation of my parlor, specifically the southeast corner, at a time when my daughter is present and experiencing her episodes. I understand this is an unusual request, but I must have evidence of what we are witnessing. Cost is no concern. Discretion is essential. Edmund Aldrich hadn't wanted a family portrait. He had wanted evidence. He had wanted proof of whatever Sarah was seeing, whatever was happening in that corner of his parlor. The formal pose with his wife had been a pretense, a way to justify the photographer's presence and extended setup time. The real subject of the photograph had always been Sarah and whatever she was transfixed by in that corner. Dr. Chen examined the high-resolution scan one final time, focusing on the mirror reflection that had troubled everyone who studied it. With the historical context in mind, she noticed something she'd previously overlooked. The reflection showed not just Sarah's impossible angle, but a faint, blurred figure in the corner, so indistinct it could have been a shadow, a defect in the old mirror's silvering, or a trick of light. But knowing what she now knew about Margaret Prescott, about Emily Blackwood, about the pattern of tragedy tied to that specific location, Dr. Chen couldn't dismiss it as mere optical artifact. Something had been in that corner when the photograph was taken, something that Sarah could see clearly, that the camera caught only as a blur, and that Edmund Aldrich had desperately wanted documented before it claimed his daughter's life. 4 days after the photograph was taken, Sarah Aldrich died, her eyes fixed until the end on something no one else could see else. The photograph remained, a frozen moment of horror and mystery, preserving a secret that had claimed at least 3 lives across nearly 50 years, and perhaps many more that history had forgotten. By late 2020, the Aldrich photograph had become one of the most analyzed historical images in recent memory. Dr. Reeves' historical research and Dr. Chen's forensic investigation had been published in multiple academic journals. The photograph itself had been subjected to every conceivable form of technical analysis, spectral imaging, chemical testing, 3-dimensional modeling, and even examination by artificial intelligence programs designed to detect photo manipulation. Every analysis confirmed the same conclusion. The photograph was authentic, unmanipulated, and genuinely captured something that defied conventional explanation. The impossible mirror reflection, the blurred figure in the corner, Sarah's fixed gaze, all were present in the original 1901 image, not artifacts of modern reproduction or digital processing. But authentication only deepened the mystery rather than solving it. If the photograph was real, then what had it captured? What had Sarah Aldrich been seeing in those final weeks of her life? What connected her experience to Emily Blackwood's decades earlier, and potentially to Margaret Prescott's tragic death in 1854? Dr. Chen organized a small conference in Salem in February 2021, bringing together historians, psychologists, photography experts, and, despite her initial reluctance, researchers who specialized in investigating allegedly paranormal phenomena. The goal wasn't to prove or disprove supernatural explanations, but to examine the evidence comprehensively and consider all possible interpretations. The conference attracted unexpected attention when Isabella Prescott Hayes, a descendant of Margaret Prescott, contacted Dr. Chen after reading about the investigation. Isabella, a retired librarian living in Vermont, had inherited family papers that included Margaret's personal diary, a document whose existence hadn't been previously known to researchers. The diary, written in Margaret Prescott's own hand between 1852 and early 1854, provided chilling context for her death. Margaret had been engaged to Robert Ashford, a prominent Salem merchant, until he abruptly broke the engagement in December 1853. The reason, Margaret wrote in anguished entries, was her cursed perception and her inability to remain silent about the things I witness. Margaret described experiencing visions from childhood, seeing what she called residual moments from the past, impressions left by strong emotions or traumatic events. She wrote eloquently about how these perceptions had isolated her, made her seem strange and unsettling to others. Robert Ashford had been willing to overlook her peculiarities until she made the mistake of describing things she had witnessed in his own family's history, things he insisted she couldn't possibly know. The engagement ended, and Margaret found herself increasingly isolated. Her own family, embarrassed by the scandal and frightened by her claims, moved her to the cottage on their estate's edge. She spent her final months alone, tormented by visions that grew stronger rather than fading. Her last diary entries, written days before her death, spoke of being overwhelmed by the accumulated suffering she perceived in the very ground of Salem itself, a town with its own dark history of tragedy, hysteria, and death. "I cannot bear it any longer," one of her final entries read. "The weight of all that has been suffered in this place presses down upon me. I see them all, the accused, the condemned, the grieving, the guilty, layer upon layer of anguish soaked into this soil. I've tried to close my mind to it, but I am too weak. The perceptions will not stop. If I cannot escape them through distance, I must escape them through death." Margaret's description of her abilities, perceiving residual moments and emotional impressions left by past events, provided a framework for understanding Emily Blackwood and Sarah Aldrich's experiences. If this type of perception existed, if certain individuals could genuinely detect psychic residue from traumatic events, then young girls, whose minds might be more open, less filtered by adult skepticism, could be particularly vulnerable to such perceptions. The location became key to this interpretation. Margaret had died in profound distress on that specific piece of ground in 1854. If her death had left its own residual impression, then Emily Blackwood and Sarah Aldrich, both sensitive girls around the same age, might have been perceiving not just Margaret's presence, but also Margaret's own overwhelming perceptions, a cascade of psychic trauma stretching back through Salem's dark history. This interpretation had the advantage of explaining the pattern: why girls of similar ages, why the same location, why the deterioration that led to death. If the impressions were too strong, too overwhelming for a young mind to process, the psychological and physiological stress could explain the wasting sickness that claimed both Emily and Sarah. But this interpretation, while internally consistent, remained unprovable by conventional scientific standards. Dr. Chen acknowledged this limitation in her conference presentation. "We have a pattern of experiences documented across decades involving individuals who reported similar perceptions in the same location," she explained. "We have historical context suggesting that location was associated with profound tragedy. We have photographic evidence that appears to show something present during Sarah Aldrich's final weeks, but we cannot definitively prove what that something was." The conference attendees debated the evidence for 3 days. Some argued for psychological explanations, mass hysteria, suggestion, or undiagnosed mental illness. Others pointed to the documentary evidence as suggesting something more unusual. A few insisted the whole thing could be explained by coincidence and confirmation bias, cherry-picking scary stories from Salem's vast historical record to create a pattern that didn't actually exist. But no one could explain the photograph itself, the impossible mirror reflection, the blurred figure in the corner, Sarah's fixed gaze, Edmund Aldrich's desperate attempt to document what he was witnessing. These elements resisted dismissal. Martha Whitmore, who had started the entire investigation by restoring the photograph, made a presentation on the final day of the conference. She had continued researching Ashworth Photography Studio's records and had discovered something overlooked in earlier searches. The studio's daybook for October 19, 1901, the day the Aldrich photograph was taken, contained a notation in the margins, written in what appeared to be the photographer's hasty hand. "Most disturbing sitting of my career. The child would not move, would not respond to any direction, stood fixed on that corner as if in a trance. Mr. Aldrich insisted we proceed despite this. Mrs. Aldrich wept throughout. I exposed 3 plates, only one developed without defect. The others showed. I cannot describe what appeared in the others. I have destroyed them at Mr. Aldrich's insistence and my own preference. I will accept no further bookings at that residence." 3 plates had been exposed. 2 had been destroyed. The surviving photograph, the one that had launched this entire investigation, was apparently the least disturbing of the 3 images captured that October afternoon. What had appeared in the others? What had been so troubling that both the photographer and Edmund Aldrich had chosen to destroy the evidence? This revelation cast the surviving photograph in a new light. If this was the sanitized version, the acceptable documentation, what had been too horrible to preserve? What had the camera captured in those destroyed images that proved too disturbing even for a father desperate for evidence? The conference concluded without definitive answers. Dr. Greaves published a comprehensive monograph documenting the historical investigation. Dr. Chen wrote a careful analysis of the psychological and forensic evidence. The photograph was eventually donated to the Library of Congress, where it remains available for examination by researchers. But the fundamental questions remain unanswered. Was Sarah Aldrich seeing something real? Was the pattern of tragedy across 3 generations the result of actual psychic phenomena or simply the accumulation of coincidence and interpretation? What was captured in that impossible mirror reflection? What appeared in the corner that held Sarah's attention until her death? The house on Charter Street still stands. Mrs. Holloway's cat still refuses to approach that corner. Residents continue to report uncomfortable feelings in that area, even those unaware of the history. The temperature anomaly persists. The magnetic readings remain erratic. In 2023, the current owner of the building agreed to let a team of researchers conduct overnight monitoring of the parlor area using thermal cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, and other equipment. The team reported several unusual readings, sudden temperature drops, electromagnetic fluctuations, and on 3 separate occasions, digital recording equipment malfunctioning when focused on the corner where Sarah had fixed her gaze. One researcher, reviewing infrared footage from the corner area, claimed to see a human-shaped thermal signature appear briefly before the camera shut down, but the footage quality was poor, and other team members disputed the interpretation. No definitive evidence was captured. The Aldrich photograph continues to generate interest, with new analyses and interpretations appearing regularly in both academic and popular publications. Some see it as proof of life after death, evidence of spirits trapped by unfinished business. Others view it as a historical curiosity, an ambiguous image made mysterious by incomplete information and human tendency to see patterns where none exist. But those who have spent time truly studying the photograph, who have looked into Sarah Aldrich's eyes in that frozen moment from 1901, often report the same reaction. There's something in her expression, in the intensity of her focus, that transcends explanation or analysis. She was seeing something real enough to hold her complete attention, something that would take her life just days later. Whatever Sarah Aldrich saw in that corner has remained there for over a century. And if the pattern holds true, it will still be there waiting when another sensitive soul eventually perceives what others cannot see. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most mysterious photographs, please leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you think Sarah was really seeing. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss future investigations into the unexplained mysteries hidden in plain sight throughout history.